The maintenance hangar at Bagram Airfield hummed with the familiar symphony of wrench clicks and hydraulic hisses, but something was different today. Colonel Marcus Hartwell had walked these concrete floors for 3 tours, had seen every type of warrior this godforsaken theater could produce, yet he'd never witnessed what unfolded before him now. In the corner, beneath the skeletal frame of an A-10 Thunderbolt II, a figure worked with surgical precision on an M24 sniper weapon system. The rifle's distinctive olive drab finish caught the harsh fluorescent light as calloused hands moved with practiced efficiency, field stripping the weapon with movements so fluid they bordered on ballet. Hartwell approached quietly, his combat boots barely whispering against the oil-stained concrete. The figure didn't look up, didn't need to. In this business, you learn to sense approaching footsteps like a survival instinct. But as he drew closer, the colonel's trained eye caught something that made his blood run cold. Along the rifle's stock, carved with the meticulous care of a surgeon's scalpel, were tiny notches, kill marks. 17 of them, each one precisely etched, each one representing a life taken through the crosshairs of that very scope. "Where did you get that rifle?" The words escaped Hartwell's lips before his military bearing could stop them. The question hung in the recycled air between them, heavy with implications that neither officer was quite ready to unpack. The hand stopped moving. For a moment, the only sound was the distant whine of a C-130's engine spooling up on the runway beyond the hangar walls. Slowly, deliberately, the figure looked up. Major Alexis Reaper Castellanos met the colonel's stare with eyes the color of storm clouds, gray, infinite, and completely unreadable. Her dark hair was pulled back in regulation fashion, but wisps had escaped during the cleaning ritual, framing a face that bore the subtle marks of someone who'd seen too much through a rifle scope. "It's mine, sir." Her voice carried the flat, emotionless tone that Hartwell recognized from his own mirror on the worst mornings. "Has been for 4 years, 7 months and 12 days. The precision of her answer sent another chill through the colonel's spine. Snipers counted everything: days, rounds, heartbeats, breath cycles. But they rarely counted time with such exactitude unless it marked something significant, something that changed them forever. Castellanos returned to her work, her movements resuming their mechanical rhythm. She pulled a cleaning rod through the barrel with the same reverence a pianist might show their instrument. The M24 wasn't just her weapon, it was an extension of her very soul, and those 17 notches told a story that few would ever understand, and fewer still would ever want to hear. The maintenance bay stretched wide around them, filled with the tools of modern warfare. F-16 Fighting Falcons stood at attention like mechanical sentinels, their sleek profiles promising death from above at Mach 2. Mechanics crawled over a wounded Apache helicopter, welding armor plating back together after another mission into the Valley of Shadows. The smell of aviation fuel mixed with gun oil and human sweat created an olfactory signature that every combat veteran carried in their memory long after they'd left the theater behind. But none of that mattered now. What mattered were those 17 marks, each one representing a story that had brought Major Alexis Castellanos to this moment, cleaning her rifle in a hangar halfway around the world from home. Hartwell had commanded infantry, had led airstrikes, had made decisions that sent young men and women into harm's way. Yet standing before this woman, he felt something he hadn't experienced since his first firefight in Fallujah: uncertainty. "Reaper," he said, using her call sign with the careful respect one might show a loaded weapon. "We need to talk." Castellanos didn't look up, but her hands paused for the briefest moment on the rifle's trigger mechanism. "Yes, sir. I believe we do." The way she said it suggested she'd been expecting this conversation for quite some time. The question wasn't whether they would discuss those 17 marks. It was whether Hartwell was prepared to hear what each one meant. Outside, the Afghan wind howled across the airfield, carrying with it the dust of a 1,000-year-old war and the promise of stories that would echo through military legend long after the last American boot left Afghan soil. But inside the hangar, time seemed suspended, waiting for the next words that would either forge a legend or destroy a career. The story of Major Alexis Castellanos was about to begin, and Colonel Hartwell had just volunteered to be its first witness. The call sign Reaper hadn't come easily. In the testosterone-fueled world of military aviation and special operations, female pilots had to earn their stripes twice, once for their skills, and once for the respect of their peers. When Second Lieutenant Alexis Castellanos first arrived at Hurlburt Field, Florida, fresh from the Air Force Academy and dripping with idealism, the seasoned airman took one look at her compact frame and determined expression and immediately dubbed her Tinkerbell. It was meant to be dismissive, a gentle mockery wrapped in the kind of casual sexism that permeated military culture like background radiation. She'd endured it with the stoic patience of someone who understood that respect wasn't given, it was taken, round by round, mission by mission. The transformation from Tinkerbell to Reaper hadn't happened overnight. It was forged in the crucible of Special Operations Command, where she'd volunteered for every dangerous assignment, every impossible mission, every deployment that other pilots found excuses to avoid. Her first kill had been clinical, professional, necessary. A Taliban sniper who'd been picking off coalition forces from a minaret in Helmand Province. The shot was clean, 847 meters through a narrow window, taken from the back of a moving helicopter at dawn. But it was the second kill that had changed everything, the third that had silenced the jokes. By the fifth, even the most hardened special operations veterans had stopped calling her Tinkerbell and started using her real name. By the 10th, they'd started calling her Reaper, and not because she was death incarnate, but because she harvested threats to American lives with the methodical efficiency of someone gathering grain. Each notch on her rifle stock represented more than a confirmed kill. They were markers of moments when split-second decisions meant the difference between a fellow American going home to their family or coming home in a flag-draped box. The 12th mark commemorated a shot that saved an entire convoy from an IED ambush. The 15th had eliminated a high-value target who'd been planning attacks on civilian contractors. The 17th, the most recent, had been 3 weeks ago, a shot that still woke her up at night despite its absolute necessity. "Tell me about Kandahar," Colonel Hartwell said, settling onto a tool cart across from where she worked. He'd done his homework in the 20 minutes since their initial encounter, pulling her service record from the secure database. What he'd found had left him questioning everything he thought he knew about modern warfare and the people who fought it. Castellanos' hand stilled completely now. Kandahar. The word carried weight in military circles, spoken in the same hushed tones reserved for Fallujah, Mogadishu, and other places where heroes were made and broken in equal measure. She set down her cleaning rod with deliberate care, the kind of precision that suggested she was buying herself time to construct her response. "Which part of Kandahar, sir?" Her voice carried no insolence, just the weariness of someone who'd lived through too much history. "The part where we lost Lieutenant Morrison to a sniper we couldn't locate. The part where I spent 6 days in a hide site waiting for one shot. Or the part where that shot saved 47 Marines who never knew how close they came to walking into a kill zone." The colonel leaned forward slightly, recognizing the tone of someone about to share something significant. In his experience, the best warriors were also the best storytellers, able to distill chaos into narrative, to make sense of senselessness through the ancient art of bearing witness. And Alexis Castellanos, he was beginning to understand, was about to tell him a story that would change how he viewed not just her, but the entire nature of modern combat. "All of it," he said simply, "start from the beginning." The beginning, as Castellanos would later reflect, hadn't actually started in Kandahar at all. It had started in a small town in New Mexico called Roswell, where a 12-year-old girl had taken her grandfather's hunting rifle and put 5 rounds through a silver dollar at 200 yards. Her grandfather, a Vietnam veteran named Samuel Castellanos who'd earned a Silver Star in the Mekong Delta, had looked at that tight grouping and seen something that both thrilled and terrified him. Natural talent was rare in any field, but in marksmanship it was almost mystical. A combination of eye-hand coordination, mathematical intuition, and emotional control that couldn't be taught, only refined. My grandfather never talked about the war, she began, her hands resuming their careful ministration to the rifle. But after that day at the range, he started telling me stories. Not about the fighting, but about responsibility. About what it meant to hold a life in your crosshairs and make a decision that would echo through eternity. Samuel Castellanos had been a sniper himself, though the Vietnam-era military hadn't called them that. They were designated marksmen, or sharpshooters, men who carried the weight of precise violence on their shoulders and the ghosts of necessary kills in their dreams. He'd recognized something in his granddaughter's steady hands and unblinking gaze, a coldness that wasn't cruel but was absolutely essential for the work that precision riflemen did in the service of their country. Under his tutelage, Alexis had learned more than just marksmanship. She'd learned the moral calculus of taking life to preserve life, the philosophical weight of being judge, jury, and executioner in the space of a heartbeat. By the time she graduated high school, she could put rounds through targets at distances that made seasoned hunters shake their heads in disbelief. But more importantly, she understood the responsibility that came with such skill. The Air Force Academy had refined her natural abilities, teaching her to apply precision thinking to more than just rifle work. Aviation, navigation, tactical planning, all required the same steady nerves and mathematical precision that had made her such a formidable marksman. But it was in special operations training where everything had crystallized, where her unique skill set had found its perfect application. Kandahar was my third deployment, she continued, never looking up from her work. But it was the first time I'd been assigned as primary overwatch for extended operations. 6 months of 12-hour shifts, watching, waiting, protecting people who would never know my name. Colonel Hartwell found himself leaning forward, drawn into the narrative despite his reservations. There was something hypnotic about watching her clean that rifle, the way her hands moved with absolute confidence over every component, every surface. It was like watching a master craftsman at work, someone who understood their tools at a molecular level. The reality of modern combat, she explained, wasn't the Hollywood fantasy of dramatic firefights and heroic charges. It was endless hours of patience punctuated by moments of absolute terror, where months of training and preparation culminated in a single trigger pull that changed everything. The radio crackled to life in the corner of the hangar, a routine check-in from tower control that reminded both officers they existed in the present moment, not in the memories Castellanos was carefully excavating. But the interruption couldn't diminish the weight of the story she was telling, couldn't break the spell of shared understanding that was building between veteran and veteran, warrior and warrior. "Tell me about the 17th mark," Hartwell said quietly. Castellanos' hand stopped moving entirely. When she looked up, her storm-gray eyes held something the colonel hadn't seen before, not regret exactly, but a kind of profound exhaustion that went deeper than physical fatigue. It was the look of someone who'd carried too much weight for too long and was finally finding someone strong enough to help bear the load. The 17th mark represented more than just another confirmed kill. It represented the moment when Major Alexis Castellanos had been forced to make a decision that would haunt her for the rest of her life. A choice between two impossible options that had ultimately saved lives at a cost that couldn't be measured in body counts or mission reports. It was the kind of story that transformed listeners, that changed how they viewed the nature of warfare and the people who fought it on their behalf. She set the rifle down completely now, her hands folding in her lap with military precision. The gesture signaled a transition from maintenance mode to storytelling mode, from present to past, from the relative safety of a maintenance hangar to the lethal complexity of urban combat in one of the world's most dangerous cities. "The 17th mark," she said, her voice dropping to barely above a whisper, represents the hardest shot I never wanted to take. 3 weeks earlier, the pre-dawn darkness over Kandahar province had been absolute, the kind of black that existed only in places where electric lights were more myth than reality. Major Castellanos had been positioned on a rooftop 500 meters from the target building, her M24 trained on windows that intelligence suggested contained high-value targets planning an attack on a nearby girls' school. The mission parameters were clear: observe, identify, and eliminate threats to civilian populations with extreme prejudice. She'd been lying prone for 6 hours, controlling her breathing, managing her heartbeat, becoming one with the rifle and the night. This was the meditative aspect of sniper work that civilians never understood, the almost zen-like state of absolute focus where time became elastic, and the world narrowed to the circle of glass at the end of her scope. Through her night vision, the building looked like a green-tinged dollhouse, its rooms laid bare to her omniscient gaze. At 3:47 hours, her radio had whispered to life with the voice of Captain Rodriguez, the ground team leader positioned 2 blocks away. Reaper 6, this is ground actual. We have visual confirmation of 3 military-aged males with weapons moving to the 2nd floor. Request immediate assessment for engagement. Castellanos had adjusted her scope's magnification, bringing the target building into razor-sharp focus. Through the window, she could see 3 figures in traditional Afghan dress, carrying what appeared to be AK-47 variants. Standard Taliban fighters, based on their movement patterns and weapon handling. But something felt wrong. The spacing was off, their body language too relaxed for people planning an imminent attack. Ground actual Reaper 6. Subjects appear to be in preparation phase. No immediate hostile intent observed. Recommend continued observation. Her voice was steady, professional, giving no hint of the calculations racing through her mind. In sniper work, patience was often more valuable than speed. A premature shot could compromise an entire operation, could transform intelligence gathering into a firefight that endangered both her team and innocent civilians. But then everything changed. At 3:52 hours, a 4th figure entered the room, smaller, moving differently. Castellanos increased magnification again, her breath catching as the thermal signature resolved into something that made her stomach clench with ice-cold dread. A child. A girl, maybe 10 or 11 years old, carrying what looked like a school bag. She wasn't there willingly. The way she moved, the posture of the adults around her, everything screamed coercion. Ground actual, we have a non-combatant in the target area. Request guidance. The protocol was clear in situations like this: minimize civilian casualties at all costs. But protocols were written by people who'd never looked through a rifle scope at a child who was about to become a human bomb. Rodriguez's response came back tense with urgency. Reaper 6, be advised we're monitoring increased chatter on Taliban frequencies. Something big is imminent. We need assessment on those military-aged males now. Through her scope, Castellanos watched in horror as one of the men began strapping what was unmistakably an explosive vest to the girl's small frame. The child stood perfectly still, her face blank with the kind of shock that preceded either complete breakdown or dissociative numbness. This wasn't just intelligence gathering anymore. This was a live hostage situation involving a child suicide bomber, and every second of delay brought them closer to an atrocity that would make international headlines. Ground actual, they're rigging the child with explosives. We have approximately 90 seconds before deployment. Castellanos' voice remained steady, but her heart was hammering against her ribs. The mathematics were brutal but simple. One shot to eliminate the bomb maker, but the angle meant the bullet would pass through thin wall material before striking target. Risk of overpenetration. Risk of hitting the child. Risk of detonating the explosives prematurely. Reaper 6, you have authorization for immediate engagement. Protect that child. Authorization. The word that transformed her from observer to executioner, from witness to active participant in the ancient calculus of life and death. Castellanos settled deeper into her firing position, her body becoming a platform of absolute stillness. Through the scope, she could see the man's hands working with practiced efficiency, turning an innocent child into a weapon of mass murder. The shot would have to be perfect, a headshot that would instantly incapacitate the target while minimizing risk to the child and avoiding detonation of the explosives. At 500 meters, in low light conditions, through glass and potentially thin wall material, with a non-combatant child in the vicinity and explosive ordnance that could detonate if struck by fragmentation or shocked by impact vibration. It was, by any reasonable standard, an impossible shot. Wind speed was negligible, temperature and humidity within acceptable parameters. The target was momentarily stationary, focused on the technical aspects of preparing the explosive device. Castellanos controlled her breathing, slowing her heart rate through techniques learned in years of training. The rifle became an extension of her nervous system, the crosshairs settling with mathematical precision on a point just above the target's left ear. In the moment before she pulled the trigger, Major Alexis Castellanos thought about her grandfather's words about responsibility, about the weight of holding life and death in her crosshairs. She thought about the child who deserved to grow up, to go to school, to have dreams and disappointments, and all the beautiful mundane experiences that comprised a full life. She thought about the families who would never know how close they'd come to losing their daughters to a terrorist attack that would now never happen. The M24 spoke with its characteristic authority, the suppressor reducing but not eliminating the sound of precision violence applied with surgical efficiency. Through her scope, Castellanos watched the target crumple instantly, the explosive vest falling harmlessly to the floor as the child stood frozen in shock and confusion. The other two men in the room scattered like startled birds, their weapons forgotten in their desperate scramble for exits and escape routes. Ground actual threat neutralized. Child is secure, moving to secondary observation position. But even as she spoke the words, even as she prepared to relocate and continue the mission, Castellanos knew that something fundamental had changed. The 17th mark on her rifle stock would represent more than just another confirmed kill. It would represent the moment she'd been forced to take a life not in the heat of combat, but in the cold precision of protecting innocence from those who would destroy it. The successful completion of the mission, the child safely evacuated, the terrorist cell disrupted, the planned attack prevented, would earn her commendations and recognition from her superiors. But late at night, when she cleaned her rifle and counted those 17 marks, she would remember the weight of making life-and-death decisions in fractions of seconds, and the terrible responsibility that came with the skill to implement those decisions with absolute precision. That night had ended with the child reunited with her family, the terrorist cell eliminated or captured, and another chapter added to the classified history of the global war on terror. But for Castellanos, it had marked the beginning of a different kind of reckoning, one that brought her to this maintenance hangar, cleaning her rifle and preparing to share her story with a colonel who was beginning to understand that he was witnessing something extraordinary. The aftermath of the Kandahar operation had rippled through military channels, with the efficiency of classified information moving between people who understood its significance. Major Castellanos had been recommended for the Distinguished Flying Cross, though the classified nature of the operation meant that most of the details would remain buried in files that few people would ever read. Her commanding officer had submitted paperwork describing her actions in the clinical language that military bureaucracy used to transform life-and-death decisions into administrative data points. But among the special operations community, word traveled through different channels, the informal network of warriors who recognized exceptional skill when they encountered it. The story of the sniper who'd made an impossible shot to save a child from becoming a human bomb passed from unit to unit, growing slightly with each telling, but maintaining its essential truth. Somewhere in Afghanistan, a woman with a rifle had done something that most trained marksmen would consider beyond the realm of possibility. Colonel Hartwell found himself studying Castellanos with new eyes as she resumed cleaning her weapon. The bureaucratic language of her service record, exceptional marksmanship, successful completion of high-value missions, demonstrated leadership under extreme circumstances, suddenly seemed woefully inadequate to describe what he was witnessing. This wasn't just a skilled soldier. This was someone who'd been forged in the crucible of impossible decisions and had emerged not broken, but refined to an almost supernatural degree of competence. "The medal's citation won't mention the child," she said, as if reading his thoughts. "Operational security requires that certain details remain classified indefinitely. Officially, I eliminated a high-value target who was preparing an attack on coalition forces. The reality is more complicated, but reality often is." She held up a component of her rifle's bolt mechanism, examining it with the critical eye of someone who understood that mechanical failure at the wrong moment could mean the difference between mission success and catastrophic failure. Every piece of equipment in her kit was maintained to standards that exceeded military specifications, not because regulations demanded it, but because her personal philosophy demanded nothing less than perfection in the tools upon which lives depended. "How do you process it?" Hartwell asked. 17 kills, countless lives saved, decisions made in split seconds that reshape entire operations. How does someone carry that weight? The question hung in the air between them, heavy with the understanding that both men had made similar decisions, had carried similar weights. Command responsibility was its own burden, sending young people into harm's way, making strategic decisions that affected thousands of lives, balancing competing priorities in an environment where perfect information was a luxury and perfect decisions were an impossibility. Castellanos set down the bolt component and looked directly at the colonel for the first time since beginning her story. Her gray eyes held depths that spoke of someone who'd stared into moral complexities that most people would spend lifetimes avoiding. "You don't process it, sir. You integrate it. Every shot becomes part of who you are. Every decision becomes part of your personal history. The alternative is to pretend that these moments don't matter, and that's a luxury that people in our position can't afford." The honesty of her response struck Hartwell like a physical blow. In a military culture that often emphasized moving forward, focusing on the next mission, maintaining operational tempo, here was someone who understood that true strength came from acknowledging the weight of command decisions rather than pretending they didn't matter. It was the difference between soldiers who broke under pressure and those who were strengthened by it. "My grandfather used to say that snipers are historians," she continued, reassembling her rifle with movements so fluid they seemed choreographed. "Every shot we take becomes part of the permanent record of human conflict. We can't change what we've done, but we can ensure that we learn from it, that we become more precise, more thoughtful, more effective at protecting the people who depend on our skills." The M24 was coming back together now, each component sliding into place with mechanical satisfaction. Watching her work was like observing a master craftsman, someone who understood their tools at a level that transcended mere technical proficiency. The rifle wasn't just her weapon. It was her instrument, the physical manifestation of years of training and experience and moral development that had shaped her into something rare and valuable and absolutely essential to the kind of warfare America was fighting in the 21st century. "Tell me about the other 16, Hartwell said quietly. The request represented a line being crossed, an acknowledgement that this conversation had moved beyond routine debriefing into something more profound. Each of those marks represented not just a confirmed kill, but a story, a moment when training and instinct and moral judgment had crystallized into action that changed the trajectory of events in ways that couldn't always be measured or quantified. Castellanos nodded slowly, as if she'd been expecting the request. "Each one has a name, a face, a story that led to that moment in my crosshairs. I remember all of them not because I want to, but because forgetting them would dishonor both their deaths and the lives their deaths protected. It was a perspective that elevated killing from mere violence to something approaching sacrament, the recognition that taking life, even when absolutely necessary, required acknowledgement, remembrance, and integration into one's personal moral framework. It was the difference between soldiers who became callous and those who became wise, between those who were consumed by their actions and those who were refined by them. The first kill had been textbook, a Taliban sniper who'd been systematically eliminating coalition forces from a concealed position in a destroyed building. Clean shot, clear target identification, immediate tactical necessity. But even textbook kills carried weight, required processing, demanded acknowledgement of the human cost of military effectiveness. The second kill had been more complex. A bomb maker who'd been using children as human shields while assembling IEDs that would later kill American soldiers and Afghan civilians alike. By the fifth kill, Castellanos had established the ritual that continued to this day, cleaning her rifle after every mission, examining each component not just for mechanical function, but as a form of meditation, a way of processing the weight of decisions made and lives taken in service of larger strategic goals. The ritual had become her anchor, the constant that allowed her to maintain psychological stability in an environment where moral certainty was rare and perfect decisions were impossible. The 12th mark represents the hardest decision I made before Kandahar, she said, her voice carrying the kind of careful neutrality that indicated significant emotional weight. A situation where the target was using his own family as human shields, where any shot carried the risk of civilian casualties, but where failure to act would result in an attack on a refugee camp that housed 3,000 displaced persons. Colonel Hartwell found himself holding his breath, recognizing the tone of someone about to share something that had fundamentally changed them. These were the stories that never appeared in after-action reports, the human moments that existed in the spaces between official documentation and personal memory, where the true cost of warfare was measured not in strategic objectives achieved, but in the moral weight carried by the people who achieved them. The tactical situation had been a nightmare of competing priorities and impossible geometry. The target, a known bomb maker responsible for at least 6 previous attacks on civilian infrastructure, had barricaded himself in a compound with his wife and 2 young children. Intelligence indicated he was in the final stages of preparing a truck bomb that would be deployed against a refugee camp within hours. Every minute of delay increased the likelihood of mass civilian casualties, but any attempt at engagement risked killing innocent family members, who were as much victims of the situation as potential collateral damage. Castellanos had spent 4 hours in position, watching through her scope as the family dynamics played out in real time. The wife was clearly terrified, the children confused and frightened by the tension in their home. The bomb maker himself moved with the focused intensity of someone committed to his mission, checking and rechecking components, preparing for an attack that would kill dozens of innocent people if allowed to proceed. The shot window was approximately 18 inches, she continued, her hands working mechanically on her rifle as she spoke. Target partially concealed behind a concrete pillar, family members moving unpredictably through the engagement zone, explosive materials present that could detonate if struck by fragmentation. The mathematics suggested approximately 60% probability of clean elimination without civilian casualties. 60%. In the abstract world of statistical analysis, those might seem like acceptable odds, but when viewed through a rifle scope, when the faces of potential collateral damage were clearly visible, when the consequences of failure included both the death of innocents and the successful execution of a terrorist attack, 60% felt like a coin flip with civilization hanging in the balance. The decision to take the shot had been made not in a moment of clarity, but in a moment of acceptance that perfect solutions didn't exist in the real world, that moral leadership sometimes required accepting terrible responsibility in service of preventing even more terrible outcomes. The shot had been clean, the target eliminated instantly, the explosive materials secured without detonation. The family had survived, traumatized but alive, their terror at witnessing sudden death balanced against their unconscious relief at being freed from complicity in mass murder. But the weight of that decision, the knowledge that she'd risked the lives of innocents in order to protect other innocents, had added a complexity to her internal moral calculus that made every subsequent decision more difficult and more nuanced. It was the kind of experience that separated career soldiers from warriors, that transformed technical proficiency into something approaching wisdom. I learned that day that being right isn't the same as feeling right, Castellanos said, her voice barely audible above the ambient noise of the maintenance hangar. The mission was successful, lives were saved, the terrorist attack was prevented, but standing over those explosive materials, looking at the family who just watched their father and husband die, I understood that victory in this kind of warfare always carries a cost that can't be measured in strategic objectives achieved. Colonel Hartwell found himself thinking about his own command decisions, the young soldiers he'd sent into danger, the strategic calculations that reduced human lives to acceptable risk percentages. Leadership at any level required a certain emotional distance, an ability to see the larger picture rather than becoming paralyzed by individual human costs. But listening to Castellanos, he was reminded that the best leaders were those who never forgot the human weight of their decisions, who carried that weight as both burden and responsibility. The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Master Sergeant Chen, a grizzled aircraft maintenance specialist, who nodded respectfully to both officers before beginning his inspection of nearby equipment. His presence served as a reminder that their discussion was taking place in the middle of an active military operation, where the machinery of war required constant attention and maintenance to remain effective. But even Chen's professional presence couldn't diminish the impact of the story Castellanos was telling, couldn't break the spell of shared understanding that was developing between two career military officers who'd both learned that leadership required making decisions that would haunt them long after their active service ended. The 13th through 16th marks on her rifle represented variations on similar themes: impossible decisions made in fractions of seconds, tactical situations where moral complexity was balanced against operational necessity, moments when her unique skills had made the difference between mission success and strategic failure. Each story revealed layers of character development, showed how repeated exposure to extreme moral pressure had refined rather than hardened her, had created someone capable of carrying tremendous responsibility without being crushed by it. The pattern you're describing, Hartwell said carefully, suggests you've been consistently placed in situations requiring exceptional judgment under extreme pressure. That's not coincidental assignment, that's recognition of unusual capability. Castellanos looked up from her rifle, meeting his gaze with something that might have been surprise. It was the first time anyone had explicitly acknowledged what she'd come to understand about her own career trajectory, that she'd become the person commanders called when normal solutions weren't adequate, when the situation required someone capable of making decisions that most people would find impossible. "I've never thought of it that way, sir." But even as she said it, both officers recognized the truth of his observation. Her assignment history read like a catalog of special operations missions that required exceptional skill, judgment, and moral fortitude. She'd become, without seeking the role, a specialist in situations where failure meant catastrophic consequences and success required walking the razor's edge between necessary violence and collateral tragedy. The 16th mark had been earned just 6 months ago, in an operation that had required her to remain in position for 72 hours, sustaining herself on minimal food and water, waiting for a single opportunity to eliminate a target who was planning coordinated attacks on multiple American diplomatic facilities. The shot itself had been technically challenging, 893 meters in variable wind conditions, through a narrow window that provided less than 2 seconds of engagement opportunity. But the technical challenge had been secondary to the moral weight of the decision, the knowledge that failure meant the deaths of diplomatic personnel who were serving their country in one of the world's most dangerous regions. The successful completion of that mission had earned her the Navy Cross, though again, the classified nature of the operation meant that the public citation contained only the barest outline of her actual achievements. Among the special operations community, however, the story had achieved legendary status. The sniper who'd made an impossible shot after 3 days of patient observation, whose precision had prevented an international incident that could have escalated regional conflicts into something much more dangerous. Master Sergeant Chen finished his equipment inspection and moved on to other duties, but not before pausing to study the rifle that Castellanos was reassembling. His experienced eye recognized quality when he saw it, understood that the weapon in her hands was maintained to standards that exceeded anything required by military regulation. He'd seen a lot of warriors over the years, had learned to recognize the ones who understood that in combat, equipment failure was often the difference between coming home and coming home in a box. "Ma'am," he said with the kind of respectful nod that veteran NCOs reserved for officers they genuinely respected, "that's a beautiful weapon." "Thank you, Sergeant. She served me well." The simple exchange carried layers of meaning that all three military professionals understood: the acknowledgement of craftsmanship, the recognition of professional competence, the mutual respect between warriors who dedicated their lives to mastering their respective crafts. After Chen departed, the conversation resumed with an intimacy that came from shared understanding of the weights that professional soldiers carried. Both Hartwell and Castellanos had dedicated their careers to serving something larger than themselves, had accepted responsibility for decisions that civilians would never have to make, had learned to find meaning in the intersection of duty, honor, and personal sacrifice. "The 17th mark," Hartwell said quietly, "represents more than just another successful mission, doesn't it?" Castellanos nodded slowly, her hands stilling on the rifle that was now fully reassembled and ready for its next deployment. "It represents the realization that I've become someone I never intended to be. Someone who's exceptionally good at making decisions that most people would find impossible. Someone who can carry weights that would crush other people. Someone who's found meaning in the intersection of violence and protection." It was a moment of profound self-recognition, the kind of clarity that came only after years of experience and reflection. She'd evolved from an idealistic young officer into something rarer and more valuable, a warrior philosopher who understood both the necessity of violence and its cost, who could apply lethal force with surgical precision while never losing sight of the human consequences of her actions. The conversation had reached a natural transition point, the moment when shared stories began to transform into shared understanding. Colonel Hartwell found himself looking at Major Cassell,